Test A. We probably already did this in class, but I'm going to go ahead and do a video anyways. That way, if you do want to rewatch the lesson, then hopefully that'll be helpful to you. I went ahead and wrote down, how do I know when to do what? You have seen this chart on every single lesson that I've done on factoring, because it's very important that you know which method to use when. So on step 1, you're always going to find the greatest common factor, if there is one. And then step 2, you're going to identify the number of terms. That tells you which method to use. If you have 2 terms, you have a couple of options. It's either the sum or difference of squares or the sum or difference of cubes. If there are 3 terms, that is your AC method. And 4 terms, it means grouping. Now this is actually a practice test. By it being a practice test, that means that I'm going to give you something that looks very similar to this. There will be 5 problems on each page, as you will see on this practice test, and you will also see that there's 20 questions altogether. That's exactly what your test is going to look like. All the problems are going to be jumbled. You will have different numbers. I'm not going to put the same problems on there as on the practice test, but I'm going to change the numbers. I'm going to jumble them around a little bit. I know this says Thompson. My name has changed to Ruggiero, so I apologize for that, but I wasn't going to rechange it for this. So let's go ahead and look at this first page of problems. One method that I did teach you guys that I think would be very helpful is if you wrote down, one, how many terms. So this has 2 terms, and then no GCF. This has 3 terms, and your GCF is going to be 5a squared b, and we'll talk about that. 3, there are 3 terms and no GCF. 4, there are 3 terms and your GCF is 3a. Number 5, there are 3 terms with no GCF. So we'll do this on each page. Just so you know, I'm making this practice test video many months after I already did 5B and 5C. So those test videos do not have me doing that step. So this is something new that I've started, and I'm just now getting to making this video. So on number 1, you see that there are 2 terms with no greatest common factor. 2 terms means that it's either the sum and difference of squares or sum and difference of cubes. Remember, if there's squares, that means that there's 2 here, and they're both perfect squares. There can be a 4, 6, 8, things like that, but we're not going to get into that in this class. So these are 2 perfect squares. So the difference of squares means that it's my car method. You draw your 2 cars. One is a good car, one is a bad car. So what times itself gives me b squared? That answer is b. What times itself gives me 81? And that answer is 9. So your answer is b plus 9, b minus 9. If you have the plus and minus switched, it's no big deal. On number 2, we have a greatest common factor of 5a squared b, and there are 3 terms. That means that this could potentially be the AC method, but first we have to take out the greatest common factor first. I knew that 5 was my part of my GCF because 5, 15, and 25. 5 goes into all of those. I knew a squared was a part of my GCF because I can pull an a squared from everything. I couldn't have pulled an a to the 3 because this one doesn't have enough for 3. And then I pulled out a b because b to the first is smaller than all of those, so that's the most I can take out from everything. So now we divide each of these terms by that 5a squared b. Well, 5 divided by 5 is a 1. You can write it or leave it off, it doesn't matter. A to the 4th divided by a squared. Well, you have 4 a's, you take 2 away, so you're left with a squared. You've got 2 b's, you take 1 away, you're left with a b to the first. Okay? Then negative 15 divided by 5 is negative 3. A squared divided by a squared, those cancel. B divided by b, those cancel. So you're left with just a minus 3 here. And then 25 divided by 5 is 5. 3 a's, you take 2 away, so you're left with an a to the first. 3 b's, you take 1 away, you're left with a b squared. So far this is what we have. Next we look inside of the parentheses, and we still have 3 terms, but here we have to have, in order to use the AC method, it has to be in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c represent just regular numbers. And you have to have a variable squared, then just one variable to the first power, and then no variables. This is not in that form because this first term alone has 2 separate variables in there, and that can't happen. So that means we cannot do the AC method on this problem. So this entire hot mess is what we have for our answer. That is factored. All right, so number 3. There's no greatest common factor, and we have 3 terms. So that's our AC method. Identify your A, B, and C. A is 3. B is negative 7. C is 2. And now we draw our flying X, like I like to call it. Remember, your A and the variable you're using go up top of the wings. A times C goes in this top section of your X. So A times 3 is 6. And then your B goes down here, which is negative 7. So we need to find out what multiplies to give us 6 and adds to give us a negative 7. So negative 1 and negative 6, those will both multiply to give me a positive 6, and they will add to give me a negative 7. You might have to play around with numbers to figure that out, but those are the 2 numbers that work. So always check. Negative 1 times negative 6 gives you a positive 6. Negative 1 plus negative 6 is a negative 7. Always check and make sure that those 2 numbers work. Before we write our answer, we have to simplify this fraction here. So our 3 and 6 simplify to be a 1 and 2. So we get 3x minus 1 here, and then an x minus 2, be careful of that negative there, here. If you had the parentheses flip-flopped, that doesn't matter. It's no big deal. It's still going to be the same answer. So on number 4, we have a greatest common factor of 3a. So we always have to take out the greatest common factor first. That's why it's step 1. So we pull out a 3a. That leaves me with a squared plus a minus 30. 3 divided by 3 was 1. 3 a's, you take 1 away, so you're left with 2. 3 divided by 3 was 1. 2 a's, you take 1 away, you're left with 1. Negative 90 divided by 3 is negative 30. And those a's cancel. That's how I got that. So now we know 3a is going to be a part of our answer. So let's go ahead and put that on the answer space. Now let's go ahead and factor. We have 3 terms. It is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, like we talked about up here. So we can do our AC method of what is inside of that set of parentheses. A is 1, B is 1, C is negative 30. So my A goes up top, negative 30 is here, and then 1 is here. So I need to find out what multiplies to give us negative 30 and adds to give us 1. That says 5 times 6. So we know if we need to get a negative number, one has to be positive, one has to be negative. Well, 5 and 6 are our numbers. The 5 is negative, and the 6 is positive. Check it. Negative 5 times 6 is negative 30. Negative 5 plus 6 is positive 1. So now I have 3a has to be up here because it was a part of our GCF. So now I have a minus 5 and a plus 6. So all of this is a part of your answer. If you did not include the 3a in your answer, the entire problem would be wrong. So be careful. When you have a GCF, that always is going to be a part of your answer. Okay, number 5 is also our AC method. So identify your A, B, and C. And there was no GCF to take out here. A is 1, B is negative 1, and C is negative 72. So our M goes on top of our wing. Negative 72 is up here, and negative 1 is down here. So we need to find out what multiplies to give us negative 72 and adds to give us negative 1. Okay, there's a lot of factors of 72. So we know that one's got to be positive, one has to be negative. That's how we get a negative 72. So 8 and 9 are our pair. That's what could give me a 1. And I need the 9 to be negative. That way it gives me a negative 1. Okay? So now I want to check. 8 times negative 9 does give me negative 72. 8 plus negative 9 does give me negative 1. So we are on the right track. So now I have m plus 8 and m minus 9. If you had them flip-flopped, it's still going to be the same answer. Okay, so now let's look at the next page. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing that we did on the last page. And I'm going to state how many terms we have and if there's a greatest common factor. So on this one, there are 2 terms. And there is no GCF. Here there are 3 terms, no GCF. Here there's 2 terms, and there is a GCF of 2AB. Remember, we can't take a C out because there's a C here, but there's not a C over here. Here there are 2 terms and no GCF. Here there are 3 terms and then you have a GCF of 3. Okay? So now let's go back up at the top. There was no greatest common factor, so now we're going to identify the number of terms. So we have 2 terms. So it's the difference, and these are perfect squares. Remember, perfect squares are numbers you get when you multiply a number by itself. A perfect cube is what you get when you multiply a number by itself 3 times. Okay? So this is a car problem. So one's a plus, one's a minus. What times itself gives you 64a squared? The answer is 8a. What times itself gives you 49d squared? The answer is 7d. Okay, that's it. That's all we have to do on this one. Okay, on number 7, there are 3 terms with no greatest common factor. So that means we're going to use our AC method. So I've identified my A, B, and C. A is 4, B is 4, C is negative 3. So on top of my wings, I get 4x. And then in this top section, A times C is negative 12. And then B is 4. So we need to find out what multiplies to give us negative 12 and then adds to give us 4. So 1 has to be positive, 1 has to be negative. So 2 and 6 are my numbers, and I'm going to have 2 be the negative one. So let's check and see if we're doing it correctly. Negative 2 times 6 is negative 12. Negative 2 plus 6 is 4. So we did it right. So before we can write our answer, remember you have to simplify your fractions first. So this 4 and negative 2 simplifies to be a 2 and negative 1. This 4 and 6 simplify to be a 2 and 3. So our answer here is going to be 2x minus 1 and then 2x plus 3. Moving on to number 8. This one is very simple, however, extremely tricky for you guys. Y'all do not like this problem at all. So I'm going to go ahead and take out my GCF first. Okay? I already explained why you could not take out a C. You can take out an A because they both have an A, and you can only take out a B because you can't take out 2 because there's not 2 here to take. Okay? So 6 divided by 2 is 3. Your A's cancel, and you have 1B left. Minus 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Your A's and B's cancel, but you still have that C left over. So now we have 2 terms inside of that set of parentheses. Well, they're not perfect squares, and they're not perfect cubes. There's no number that multiplies by itself to give you 3 or 2. So that means we're finished. There's nothing else that we can do. So that gives me 2AB times 3B minus 2C for my answer. Okay, so now we look at number 9. On number 9, we have y to the third minus 1. So there is no greatest common factor. So since there are 2 terms, we know it's our difference of cubes because I multiply y by itself 3 times to get y to the third. So that's my car bus. First thing you do is wash it with soap. Same, opposite, always positive. So the same as a negative would be a negative. Opposite of that would be a positive. And then this last one is always positive. So now it's cube root, cube root. What times itself 3 times gives me y to the third? That answer is y. Now y'all know I pay my credit card. And then what times itself 3 times gives me 1? That answer is 1. Okay? Now, square, multiply, square. So use your car for this. So y squared is going to give me y squared. Multiply them together to get y. If you wrote 1y, that's okay. And then you square this last one. So 1 squared is 1. That's our final answer. Okay. So now let's look at the last one on this page. Problem number 10. On number 10, I have a greatest common factor of 3. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out that 3 to get 2x squared minus 3x minus 5. And I got that by dividing all of these terms by 3. Now, I have 3 terms inside, so I'm going to do my AC method. A is 2, B is negative 3, C is negative 5. And just before I move any further, I'm going to go ahead and put that 3 on my answer space just so I don't forget it. Okay? So now I draw my flying X. 2x goes on the top of the wings. 10, and it's a negative. So negative 10 goes up top of the X here. Negative 3 is down here. So I know that one's going to be a positive and one's going to be a negative. 2 and 5 is my pair, and then the 5 is the negative. So 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. 2 plus negative 5 is negative 3. So that means that we are on the right track. But before I can write my answer, I have to simplify when possible. So those 2's simplify to be 1's. And make sure you write those 1's because it'll confuse you if you don't. And then 2 and -5 don't simplify. So that leaves me with x plus 1, 2x minus 5. And don't forget, you've got to have that 3 in there in order to receive credit for this problem. Okay, so now let's go ahead and label everything again. And guys, you can go ahead and label your terms and your greatest common factor on every page before you go through. I'm just doing it just so we, see practice and don't forget about it. So here we have 3 terms and no greatest common factor. Here we have 3 terms and a GCF of 3. Here we have 4 terms and no greatest common factor. 3 terms and no GCF. And then here we have 2 terms and no GCF. I'm going to go ahead and address number 15. A squared plus 4. No greatest common factor. It's 2 terms and it's the addition of squares, so the sum of squares. We know that answer is always prime. Guys, I'm going to give you at least one of these on the test. So go ahead, and if you want to go ahead and find that problem right off the bat, find one where it's addition with 2 perfect squares. That way it's out of the way and you know it's done. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and move up to number 11. We have 3 terms with no greatest common factor. So it's the AC method. A, B, C. A is 1, B is -4, C is -21. You get an X on top of your wings, a -21 at the top of the X, and a -4 at the bottom. So we know one has to be a positive and one of our numbers has to be a negative. 3 and 7 are our numbers, and the 7 is negative. So we have 3 and -7. So let's check and make sure. 3 times -7 is -21. 3 plus -7 is -4. So we did it right. So now we write our answer, x plus 3 and x minus 7. Now we're finished with that one. Let's look at number 12. There's 3 terms with a GCF of 3. So we're going to pull out a 3 to get c squared plus 2c minus 3. And now, so that's our GCF. So there's 3 terms here. So that's our AC method. A is 1, B is 2, C is -3. So your C goes on top of your wings. -3 is here, +2 is here. So we need to find out what multiplies to give us -3 and adds to give us a 2. We know one number is positive and one number is negative. Well, if we want a positive number in the outcome, we want our smaller number to be negative. So a -1 and a +3. Let's check our work and make sure we're doing it correctly. -1 times 3 is -3. -1 plus 3 is 2. So we did it right. So we have C minus 1, C plus 3. And you just write that next to your GCF. Okay? So now let's look at number 13. On number 13, there are 4 terms. Well, we know 4 terms means grouping. So you group your first 2 terms and then your second 2 terms. Now we take our greatest common factor of each group. Greatest common factor here is a squared. So you get a plus 1. And a plus 1 doesn't have a greatest common factor, but remember in grouping you have to take something out. So the only thing we can take out is a 1. So remember, this is your checkpoint. You have to have the same thing in both of these sets of parentheses. We do, so I'm going to pull a plus 1 out of there. And when I do, I'm left with a squared plus 1. So I have a plus 1 and then a squared plus 1. Now let's look at number 14. It's 3 terms, no greatest common factor. So that's our AC method. I don't know if y'all have noticed, but most of these problems are AC method problems, which means that you are probably going to have a lot of those on your test, which means it's probably the most important type as well. So make sure this is the method that you know front and back. So I have A is 1, B is 2, C is negative 15. So I need to find out what multiplies to give us negative 15 and adds to give us a 2. And I put x's on top of my wings. One has to be positive and one has to be negative. So I'm going to use the 3 and the 5, and I'm going to make the 3 negative. So negative 3 times 5 is negative 15. Negative 3 plus 5 is a positive 2. So we are on the right track. So I have x minus 3, x plus 5. We are good to go. Now let's move on to our last page of this practice test, which is going to be last 5 problems. So here I have 3 terms, no GCF. Here I have 4 terms with no GCF. I have 2 terms with a GCF of 2x. Here I have 3 terms with a GCF of negative 1. Remember, guys, you never want that first term to be negative. So if it is, you have to pull out at least a negative 1. And then on number 20, you have 4 terms, and there is no greatest common factor. Okay? So let's look at number 16. 3 terms, no GCF, straightforward and to the point. It's the AC method. So A is 1, B is negative 14, C is 24. On top of my wings, I put my C. 24 goes at the top of the x, negative 14 goes at the bottom. So I need to find out what multiplies to give us 24 and adds to give us negative 14. Now I've got 2 scenarios. I can either have 2 positive numbers or 2 negative numbers, because that's how I can get a positive 24. Well, if they have to add to give us a negative number, they've got to have negatives in there. So that's why they both have to be negative. So the only ones that would add to give me that negative 14 would be negative 2 and negative 12. So let's make sure we're on the right track. Negative 2 times negative 12 is positive 24. Negative 2 plus negative 12 is negative 14. So now we write our answer. And there we go. So now let's look at number 17. This is a grouping problem because there are 4 terms. So underline your first 2 terms and then your second 2 terms. So my first 2 terms have an x in common, so I'm left with x minus 2. Now look at your second 2 terms. You might say your GCF is 3, but it's not. It is a negative 3 because you don't want that first term to be negative. Okay? So I'm going to pull out that negative 3, which leaves me with an x. 6 divided by negative 3 is negative 2. Now I pull out my common parentheses, which are x minus 2, and I'm left with x minus 3. Okay, and that's it for that one. On number 18, there's two terms, and we have a greatest common factor of 2x. So I have to pull out the 2x first. That leaves me with 8x to the third plus 1. Remember, when you divide something exactly by itself, it leaves you with a 1. I'm going to put my GCF over here on my answer space. So now on the inside, there's two terms, and it's the sum of cubes, okay, because 8x to the third and 1 are both perfect cubes. So that means carbus. So same, opposite, always positive. So if I start off with a positive, then I have the same, which is a positive, opposite is a negative, and always positive is a plus. So now, cube root. What times itself gives me, or 3 times gives me 8x to the third? The answer is 2x. What times itself 3 times gives me 1? The answer is 1. So now, square multiplies square. 2x squared means 2x times 2x, which is 4x squared. Multiply these two numbers together to get a 2x here. And then you square this, so 1 times 1 is 1. So now we write that on our answer space. And that is our final answer. Don't forget to include that 2x. Now let's look at number 19. We have to take out the GCF of a negative 1 because we can't have that first term to be negative. So we get x squared plus 5x minus 9. You're dividing each of those terms by a negative. That's why all of the signs changed. Now there's 3 terms, so we do our AC method. Don't forget to put your GCF on your answer space. So I'm filling in my x. I need to find out what multiplies to give me negative 9 and adds to give me 5. So 1 has to be positive, 1 has to be negative. Now 1 and 9 and 3 and 3 are the only factors of 9. None of those could either add or subtract each other to get a 5. So that means that you can't do the AC method here. But it's not prime. It is only prime if you can't factor it by the number of terms and you can't have and you don't have a GCF. But on 19 you do. You have a GCF of negative 1. So your answer is going to be that right there. That is your final answer. Now looking on to number 20, the last one of this practice test. Underline your first 2 terms. This is grouping because it's 4 terms. So your GCF of the first 2 terms is going to be 5m, which leaves you with 2m minus 3n. Okay, where we divided both of these by 5m to get that answer. Then we pull out a 2n. When we divide both of those by 2n, we get 2m minus 3n. Do your check. Do you have the same number in each set of parentheses? The answer is yes. So let's go ahead and pull this out. 2m minus 3n comes out. And you're left with 5m plus 2n on the inside. And that is your final answer. Remember, if you can do this practice test without any assistance by just checking your answers, you should be able to do this test with no issues. Remember that factoring is the absolute most important type of concept that you're going to have to learn. You have to be able to factor in order to be able to pass this class. So make sure that you know how to do this. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, call me, or come to my office hours. I wish you the best of luck.